I'm excited to be able to share our work on this important project with you. I will be talking about the Division on Addiction's development of a tool called the Computerized Assessment and Referral System, or CARS, to identify mental health issues among DUI offenders and others, and provide information about those issues and their potential treatment. CARS has been many years in the making and is now available for free download at carstrainingscenter.org. The website includes a training manual and all of the information you need to implement CARS. First, I want to recognize our funders. The Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility has provided primary support for the development of CARS, and just as importantly, its testing. Some of the research in this presentation was funded by NIAAA as part of 2 studies we conducted of mental health disorders among repeat DUI offenders. To begin, I would like to provide you with a little bit of background about what led to the development of CARS and why we believe there is a need for tools like CARS. Then I'll talk about the tool itself, how we've developed and tested the tool, and provide answers to some questions we're often asked about CARS. The first question we need to address in understanding the development and need for CARS is why we need DUI treatment in the first place. How we answer this question influences how we intervene in DUI behavior and how we attempt to tailor treatment. Let's start at the beginning. Cars have been around for over a century now. In 1885, the first internal combustion engine automobile was created. In 1902, the first assembly lines went into operation. By 1904, less than 20 years after the first automobile, the Journal of Inebriety already reported on DUI-related crashes and fatalities. They said 25 fatal accidents occurring to automobile wagons. In 19 of these accidents, the drivers had used spirits within an hour of the disaster. So 76% of motor vehicle fatalities were alcohol-related in 1904. So alcohol in automobiles and their consequences have gone hand in hand from the start. We all know how dire the consequences of DUI are. This is one of our primary public health problems. DUI is the second most common type of crime in the U.S. In 2013, more than 10,000 people died in alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents in which the driver had a BAC of 0.08 or higher. That was 31% of total motor vehicle fatalities in the U.S. And the annual economic cost is estimated to be approximately $49.8 billion. Let's think about repeat DUI offenders in particular for a moment. Repeat DUI offenders represent about a third of those who are arrested for DUI, and they are responsible for high proportions of the harm that comes from DUI. So the real question to ask is why they continue their behavior despite the sanctions, information, and initiatives that we have in place. Over time, we've taken a number of different steps to reduce DUI and DUI reoffense. These include information campaigns, random roadside checkpoints, school education. Some other initiatives to both deter DUI and prevent DUI relapse include licensing sanctions, vehicle sanctions, ignition interlock, and mandatory sentencing. But when we look at the research around some of these initiatives, they aren't as effective as we would hope. For example, license suspensions and revocations lead to some reductions in recidivism, but we also know that these DUI offenders continue to drive. And ignition interlocks have been perhaps the most successful of these sanctions, greatly reducing recidivism. But a whole portfolio of research by Dr. Vosa's team at Pyre suggests that their effectiveness is limited to the time period when they are installed. Recidivism rates return to non-interlock levels once the interlock is removed. This suggests that these interventions are serving as band-aids, but not addressing the problem fully. This chart might be familiar to you. Don't worry about whether you look at the red or the blue lines. They're just different ways of calculating the percent of motor vehicle fatalities that are alcohol-related. Also, don't worry about the blip around 2001. This is when NHTSA changed to a different way of calculating these numbers. The main point of this chart is that we saw major reductions in alcohol-related motor vehicle fatalities through the end of the 20th century. This is potentially due to many people changing their behavior due to the information campaigns and interventions. Then we see a leveling off of that reduction. The chart plateaus from 2006 to 2010 to 2013, we're no longer seeing the reductions we saw before. This suggests that we need a new strategy. We hypothesize that repeat DUI offenders today are not getting the message. They aren't deterred in the ways that others have been. A paper in the Journal of Health Economics by Sloan and his colleagues found that people who drink and drive frequently have just as much knowledge about DUI and its consequences as everyone else. We hypothesize that the reason DUI offenders today aren't getting the message is not lack of information, but because of underlying issues that compromise their ability to change their behavior. At the division, we've focused our studies specifically on mental health issues among DUI offenders, especially those issues outside the realm of substance use disorders. The co-occurrence of psychiatric and substance use disorders has serious implications for DUI treatment and recovery. This is not a new idea. Back in 1985, there was a study published that concluded treatment programs focusing exclusively on changing alcohol consumption behavior are not likely to reduce accident risk for some of the offender groups. Wells Parker and her team found this, but despite this work from more than 30 years ago, many treatment programs today for DUI focus on alcohol education, and if they're good, alcohol use disorders. Few address other mental health issues that might underlie these problems. At the Dr. Schaefer has developed the addiction syndrome model. According to this model, expressions of addiction are opportunistic and associate with vulnerable hosts. Behavioral, like gambling disorders, and chemical, like alcoholism, expressions primarily have common biopsychosocial etiology and shared sequelae. This means that they have common risk factors and also common consequences. And importantly, this model also posits that psychiatric disorder is usually antecedent to addiction, although sometimes consequent. In other words, psychiatric disorders go hand in hand with addiction and often precede them. The more we learn about substance use and addiction, the more the failure to address co-occurring mental health issues seems like a missed opportunity within settings like DUI programs. At the division, our work is guided by this syndrome model of addiction. To think about this, I'm going to take you back to middle school math class. Imagine that the circle in the middle here represents people with an addiction problem, or in our case, a repeat DUI offender with an alcohol use disorder. But if we start looking further, we might find that a significant proportion also experience manic episodes. Who knew Venn diagrams could come in so handy? Another proportion might have major depression. Some likely have personality disorders, and others might have disorders that you haven't assessed for. What you're left with is a very small proportion that suffer from pure addiction per se. We know from past work that this is the case with most addictions. A large proportion of people with addiction also suffer from other mental health disorders. But what about DUI offenders? At the division, we conducted a project at a residential program for repeat DUI offenders in Massachusetts. We administered everyone a comprehensive mental health assessment at intake to the program. Here's what we found. 98% of the sample qualified for an alcohol or drug use disorder, nicotine dependence, or a gambling disorder. About a quarter qualified for conduct disorder, attention deficit disorder, or intermittent explosive disorder, all disorders related to impulse control. 20% had post-traumatic stress disorder or another anxiety-related disorder. 12% had major depression or dysthymia, and 8% qualified for bipolar disorder. And similar to the theoretical diagram we saw before, there was significant overlap between these disorders. And how does this psychiatric comorbidity, meaning the co-occurrence of multiple mental health disorders, compare to the general population? In our study, we used the same mental health assessment as that used in a large general population study, the National Comorbidity Survey Replication, conducted by Dr. Ron Kessler and his team. This allowed us to compare our findings among repeat DUI offenders to findings from the general population sample. Not surprisingly, and not presented here, the repeat DUI sample had significantly elevated rates of alcohol and drug use disorders. More importantly, as shown here, we found significantly elevated rates of conduct disorder, bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety, and PTSD. Overall, about half of the sample qualified in their lifetime for a psychiatric disorder that was not a substance use disorder. And compared to the general population, we also found that repeat DUI offenders were significantly more likely to qualify for more than one disorder. But even if psychiatric comorbidity is high among DUI offenders, there is still a question of whether these mental health issues are linked directly to DUI behavior itself. In the study I just described of repeat DUI offenders, we also tracked criminal offense for 5 years after DUI offenders left the residential program. This chart compares the number of disorders each offender qualified for and whether they reoffended. The blue line shows that most people had 1 or 2 disorders, and then that rate declines. So just over 10% of the sample had 4 disorders. More importantly, the red line shows that as the number of disorders increases, rate of reoffense increases. This tells us that DUI offenders with greater lifetime history of mental health problems are more likely to reoffend. This chart shows the same kind of pattern in a different way. The important line here is the red line. This represents DUI offenders who had psychiatric disorders other than substance use disorders. They were more likely to recidivate than others. This is a survival curve, so the percents represent the percent of people who haven't recidivated across time. So basically, our research and others have shown that mental health disorders are highly prevalent in DUI offender populations, and that there is some evidence that they influence recidivism. So why don't DUI programs screen for and address these issues? There are several barriers to this type of screening. Awareness is one, and a first step is education for people and programs that these issues are prevalent in the DUI offender population. Training is another. Most DUI programs don't have clinicians available to assess for mental health problems. I think the biggest barrier across programs that we've found is lack of time or resources. Lack of immediate output refers to the fact that past validated assessment tools, like the one used in the National Comorbidity Survey replication, don't have user-friendly output. They're built for research. So we know that DUI treatment providers don't always have the training or resources to identify and address mental health issues in their clients. One issue we often run into is that providers are resistant to the idea of a standardized screening or assessment tool. The idea is that if there's a problem, they'll identify it through counseling discussions. I have a couple of examples of why this doesn't always work well, but I think this is the most pertinent example. In this study, they compared diagnoses obtained as part of alcohol treatment as usual for DUI offenders to diagnoses obtained on those same offenders using a standardized diagnostic interview, the Composite International Diagnostic Interview. So what we see here is that when we look at bipolar disorder, the providers estimated that about 1% of the clients suffered from bipolar disorder. The standardized interview found that actually 6% suffered from bipolar disorder. Providers estimated 10% of their clients had depression. The interview suggested it was closer to 25%. The providers did not estimate that anyone had obsessive compulsive disorder, and yet the interview found between 2 and 3% did. And interestingly, for drug use disorder, the providers estimated that 27% of their clients suffered from drug use disorder, whereas the standardized interview suggested it was closer to 11%. The point here isn't just that underdiagnosis is going on, which is the case for most of these, but really that we see what we're looking for. So in this case, this was alcohol treatment, and so providers were actually potentially overdiagnosing drug use disorder and underdiagnosing everything else. So to review, we know that there's psychiatric comorbidity in DUI populations. We know that these mental health issues are likely linked to recidivism. We know that screening for mental health issues beyond alcohol use disorders is rare within DUI treatment programs, and we know that DUI treatment providers rarely have the training or experience to identify these mental health issues among their clients. Enter CARS. We've spent 5 years developing the Computerized Assessment and Referral System, referred to as CARS. The immediate purpose of this system is to provide counselors and intake coordinators at DUI programs and courts with a tool they can use to screen for mental health disorders among their clients and provide referrals for additional treatment for these issues. The tool provides a user-friendly, individually targeted report that can be shared between counselors and clients. As I said before, the Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility funded the development of CARS. We have also collaborated with Dr. Ron Kessler and his team at the Harvard School of Public Health. He was one of the founders of the original Composite International Diagnostic Interview, and his team has helped us adapt the CIDI questions for use in CARS. Over the last few years, we have programmed the tool to provide immediate diagnostic information for DSM-4 Axis 1 disorders. Programs can choose which modules to use and can even use the screener on its own depending on time available and resources. We have programmed individual diagnostic reports that provide information about the mental health disorders for which a client qualifies or is at risk, as well as a summary of biopsychosocial risk factors. The tool includes a biopsychosocial section that asks about past 12-month stressors in a person's life. The reports are also geographically targeted to zip code. Potential users of CARS often ask whether it's a risk assessment or whether it predicts recidivism. Though CARS might do both eventually, it is important to review its primary purpose here. We know that mental health issues are associated with repeat DUI behavior, and we know that untreated mental health issues in particular reduce the effectiveness of substance use treatment. So CARS' primary purpose is to identify mental health issues that influence DUI, and then we hope that identification of these issues is a first step toward intervening to reduce their impact on DUI and improve offenders' chances of rehabilitation. CARS is unique as a mental health assessment in several ways. First of all, it's adapted from an internationally validated instrument, the Composite International Diagnostic Interview. Secondly, it can be used by non-clinicians to identify psychiatric disorders for which a client qualifies or is at risk. It generates user-friendly reports at the click of a button. And finally, CARS runs on free open-sourced software, so there aren't setup expenses or costs. I want to speak briefly now about some of the testing that we've done and what we plan to do in the development of CARS. In beginning our work, it was very important to us to have the users involved from the very start. We wanted to avoid a helicopter approach of just dropping something in and trying to get programs to adapt to it. Instead, we proceeded in 2 phases. In the first phase, the usability trial, we simply provided CARS to counselors at multiple DUI programs and asked them to use it in whatever way they could. We wanted to get rid of barriers, so we didn't have a specific number of interviews they needed to do or restrictions on participating. We used the trial for feedback, not for data. Based on that feedback, we made changes and then did a full randomized implementation trial. From there, we tested remote implementation at 6 pilot sites across the nation. Now we are releasing CARS for public distribution and hoping to create CARS partnerships across the country to facilitate screening and research. Briefly, in our usability trial, we recruited 5 DUI programs to test CARS for 3 months. We had staff complete surveys each week. Clients also filled out surveys about their experiences. The overall feedback from this trial was positive. Clients found the report CARS generated particularly useful. The largest concern was the time that it took to complete CARS. To respond to this concern, we undertook a major modification of CARS, enhancing the screener module so that it could potentially stand alone as an assessment. Originally, the CARS screener, which is just one module of CARS, could not stand alone. For example, if someone answered yes to the question, "Have you ever in your life had a period of time lasting several days or longer when most of the day you felt sad, empty, or depressed?" they received a positive screen for depression, and yet a large majority of the population might answer yes to this question. To address this, we used evidence from past studies to add questions to the screener to increase its diagnostic accuracy. We now offer a CARS screener that takes 20 to 50 minutes to complete and offers good indication of diagnostic areas that need further assessment. We next tested CARS in a randomized clinical trial in 2 DUI programs in Massachusetts. These included a first offender and a repeat offender program. We randomized within program. So some clients received CARS screener, some received the comprehensive CARS assessment, some received a self-administered screener, and some received an interviewer-administered screener. And we also measured follow-up outcomes. In viewing the following slides, note that the screener findings are from the CARS screener only, not from the full CARS assessment. A positive screen indicates that further assessment is required, not that the respondent qualifies for the disorder. The full CARS assessment provides more precise diagnostic information. Not surprisingly, most repeat offenders screened positive in their lifetime for an alcohol use disorder, and more than a third screened positive for a drug use disorder. More than 60 screened positive within the past year for alcohol use disorder, and 15% screened positive within the past year for a drug use disorder. For both alcohol and drug use disorders, among offenders who received the full CARS assessment, all of those who screened positive went on to qualify for the disorder when further criteria were assessed. Looking at anxiety disorders next, close to 50% of repeat DUI offenders screened positive in their lifetime for panic disorder. More than 40% screened positive in their lifetime for generalized anxiety disorder. More than a third screened positive in their lifetime for post-traumatic stress disorder, and 30% screened positive in their lifetime for social phobia. These numbers were lower but still considerable for past year positive screens. For generalized anxiety, among offenders who received the full CARS assessment, about 1 in 3 of those who screened positive went on to qualify for the disorder when further criteria were assessed. For PTSD, it was more 1 in 5, and we don't have enough data to calculate these rates for panic disorder or for social phobia. For mood disorders, approximately 40% of repeat offenders screened positive in their lifetime for depression. Approximately 25% screened positive in their lifetime for mania, and almost 20% had experienced suicidal ideation in their lifetime. These numbers were lower but still considerable for past year positive screens. For depression, among offenders who received the full CARS assessment, about 2 in 5 of those who screened positive in the past year went on to qualify for the disorder when further criteria were assessed. For mania, it was about 1 in 2. For childhood disorders, close to 50% of repeat DUI offenders screened positive for a history of conduct disorder. More than 30% screened positive for attention deficit disorder, and close to 30% screened positive for oppositional defiant disorder. Though full assessment of these disorders were not available for these disorders by comparison, just over 20% of first-time offenders screened positive for a history of conduct disorder, and just over 10% screened positive for ADHD or ODD. Past year screening results for interviewer-administered and self-administered CARS screener did not differ significantly. For lifetime screening results, only 3 of 40 comparisons yielded differences. This is important because it suggests that these different modes of administration will produce similar results. The implementation trial provided continued evidence of comorbidity in the repeat DUI population, particularly as it relates to anxiety-related disorders. The results from the self-administered screener do not differ fundamentally from those for the interviewer-administered screener, which is a promising finding. If anything, the self-administered screener might be more sensitive for some disorders. And finally, this implementation trial showed that both counselors and clients are able to use CARS in a DUI program setting. In moving from the implementation trial to the national pilot, one finding from our trial influenced the variety of pilot sites we selected. In our study, 48% of repeat offenders entered the mandatory inpatient treatment program more than 12 months after their offense. 33% entered 6 to 12 months after their offense, and only 12% entered within 2 to 6 months of their offense. Many months can pass between the time an individual is sentenced and the time he or she begins a mandatory alcohol treatment program. This window of time could potentially be an opportunity for assessment and diagnosis for at-risk clients. Assessment at this level also provides an opportunity to direct the treatment each offender receives according to his or her unique psychological, social, and medical needs. Therefore, we sought to pilot CARS at sites located not only in a variety of geographical locations, but also a variety of intervention points along the DUI arrest, conviction, sentencing, and treatment pathway. We selected 6 pilot sites throughout the U.S. These included probation departments, DWI courts, assessment and treatment programs. Specifically, our sites included Impact, located in Wisconsin, Isanti County Probation Department, located in Minnesota, Lackawanna Susquehanna Office of Drug and Alcohol Programs, located in Pennsylvania, Laramie County DUI Court, located in Wyoming, San Joaquin DUI Monitoring Court, located in California, and the South St. Louis County DWI Court and Probation Department, also located in Minnesota. The sites used CARS for between 3 and 4 months and provided feedback about their experiences. The sites provided the following feedback. First, they were concerned that the screener wasn't specific enough, meaning that it gave too many people positive screens for a disorder. This is always a trade-off with screeners. You either cast the net widely so you don't miss anyone, but end up catching additional non-cases, in this case, people who receive positive screens but do not actually qualify for a disorder, or you cast your net more narrowly but risk missing actual cases. In this case, that would be people who qualify for a disorder but are missed by the screener. To address their concern, we added a grid to the screener that assesses how much each mental health problem interferes with an individual's daily functioning. We now use these additional criteria to determine a positive screen. Next, sites requested the ability to provide more targeted referrals. In response to this, we added a user interface to CARS that allows programs to enter and edit their own referrals and resources to be added to the referral database and used in the zip code targeted report. Sites also indicated that time and resources required to use either just the screener or at the most past year versions of the modules were all they had. Based on this feedback, we focused our initial release of CARS on the screener and past year versions of the modules. We will add lifetime and comprehensive versions as time progresses. Finally, in response to the request for more explicit instructions and protocols, we have expanded our training manual and added quick guides that are all posted on the website. Other requests we hope to address in the future include adapting CARS to web-based and mobile versions, creating a Spanish language version, updating CARS to DSM-5, and creating an interactive training module. On June 19th of this year, we launched our CARS web portal, carstrainingscenter.org. The portal includes the CARS program for free download, training materials, background information, publications, and other resources, including a data repository moving forward. I want to end with a quote by Karl Menninger that has guided our development of cars. Treatment depends upon diagnosis, and even the matter of timing is often misunderstood. One does not complete a diagnosis and then begin treatment. The diagnostic process is also the start of treatment. Diagnostic assessment is treatment. It also enables further and more specific treatment. Special thanks to everyone who has helped us in this long process in the development of cars. That includes people here at the division as well as the staff and the clients of the programs who have participated in our trials. For additional resources in addition to carstrainingscenter.org, you can visit the division's website, divisiononaddiction.org, or also the division's website for brief science reviews and editorials, basisonline.org. Thank you.